Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we are going to tiptoe through the shadows of history and faith, chasing after one of the most elusive figures in human history. You're huddled under the covers, maybe a little too comfortable, as we peel back the layers on a mystery that has puzzled believers and scholars for 2,000 years. We're going to ask a simple, yet impossibly complex question. Did the Virgin Mary really die, or was she taken, body and soul, into heaven? You probably won't survive this journey unscathed, at least not with your neat, tidy preconceptions intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, if you're brave enough, post your location and local time down in the comments. It's always fascinating to know just how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're walking through a silent, dusty street in Jerusalem, the air thick with the smell of olives and hot stone. It's a few decades after the events we all know so well, and the Christian community, still a small, fragile thing, is finding its feet. You're looking for a woman, an old woman now, who was once at the very centre of it all. You ask around, whispering her name, Mary. But nobody seems to know what became of her. There are no grand memorials, no pilgrimage sites, no stories of a final triumphant end. There is, for the most part, just silence. This, you realise, is the single most compelling piece of evidence in the entire debate, the deafening quiet of the earliest records. For all the detail and drama found in the Gospels and the Acts of the Apostles, the New Testament has absolutely nothing to say about how Mary's life ended. Think about that for a moment. We have meticulous accounts of Jesus' final days, the Apostles' martyrdoms, and even the minor details of their journeys. But for the woman who birthed the Messiah, the one who stood at the foot of the cross, the historical record simply falls silent. It's as if a grand story simply stopped mid-sentence. Now, a mainstream historical fact you might find surprising is just how late the first written accounts of Mary's final days actually appear. The earliest texts we have that even hint at her death don't show up until the 4th and 5th centuries AD. That's a huge gap, a chasm of 300 to 400 years. For context, that's like trying to write a detailed biography of a major historical figure from the American Revolution today, based only on whispered folk tales and legends passed down by your great-great-great-grandparents. We have more reliable, contemporaneous information about the lives of Roman emperors and philosophers than we do about Mary's final moments. So what gives? Why the silence? Historians still argue whether this quiet is a sign of her importance. Perhaps her end was too sacred to be put to paper, or a sign that the early church simply wasn't that interested in her as a figure of veneration yet. It's a genuinely fascinating paradox. On one hand, she's the Mother of God. On the other, she's treated almost like a footnote after the crucifixion. This is where a quirky or fringe tidbit comes in. A few early church writers, like the obscure Epiphanius of Salamis in the late 4th century, actually acknowledged this silence. He wrote that nobody really knew what happened to Mary. He speculated a few possibilities. Maybe she died and was buried. Maybe she was martyred. Or maybe she just lived out a long life in obscurity. He didn't even mention the idea of an assumption or falling asleep. In a way, he was just as baffled as we are, and he was living over 1,500 years closer to the event. The earliest stories about her passing were not from official church documents, but from a genre of literature called the Apocryphal Acts and Gospels. These were wild, often fantastical stories that filled in the gaps left by the Bible. They were the fan fiction of the ancient world. You get the sense that people were so desperate for a good story about what happened to Mary that they were happy to invent one, complete with angels, miraculous appearances, and heavenly choirs. These texts weren't considered canonical or divinely inspired by the mainstream church, but they were incredibly popular and circulated widely, passed from hand to hand like treasured secrets. One of the oldest and most influential of these is called the Dormition of the Theotokos, which means the falling asleep of the God-bearer. This text describes Mary's death not as a death in the traditional sense, but as a peaceful, painless falling asleep. The story goes that just before she died, all the apostles who were scattered across the known world were miraculously brought to her side on clouds to say goodbye. It's a beautiful, dramatic scene, completely unlike the quiet, unceremonious ends of most people at the time. Imagine Peter, Paul and John all appearing out of thin air, just in time to be with her. It's a story that clearly grew out of a desire for a fitting, majestic end for such a significant figure. So, while you might expect to find her death mentioned in the very first books of the Bible, you find nothing. Instead, you find a story that slowly, tentatively, and then with a growing roar, begins to take shape hundreds of years later, far from the dusty streets of Jerusalem. This is a crucial point to understand, because it tells us that the belief in Mary's special end wasn't something that began with the apostles, but something that developed over time as her role in the Christian imagination grew. It's a classic example of faith filling in the gaps where history falls silent. And in the next section, we'll start to look at some of the other ancient groups, the ones you probably don't know much about, who had their own completely different ideas about how the world worked and where Mary fit into it. You'll find that Christianity didn't emerge into a vacuum, but into a swirling sea of competing ideas and beliefs, some of which had some very strange things to say about the world's most famous mother. You're leaving the quiet, dusty streets of Jerusalem and heading out into the wilderness, a place where new ideas and ancient traditions swirled together like desert dust devils. This isn't a journey into the heart of mainstream Christianity as we know it today, but a detour into the wild, untamed frontier of first-century religious thought. The world Mary lived in was far more complex and religiously diverse than we often imagine. Christianity didn't just appear fully formed. It emerged from a vibrant, often chaotic ecosystem of Jewish sects, Hellenistic philosophies, and strange esoteric cults. Understanding this environment is key to understanding why stories about Mary's death and Assumption began to take root hundreds of years later. Imagine you're walking along the shores of the Dead Sea. The air is heavy, salty, and hot. You can see the caves in the cliffs where the Essenes lived. This was a super strict communal Jewish sect that was all about purity, asceticism, and waiting for the end of days. They lived a life of celibacy and communal ownership, and they produced some of the most important religious documents of all time, the Dead Sea Scrolls. We know a lot about them, but here's a quirky tidbit. Some scholars have theorized that Jesus, or at least John the Baptist, may have had some contact with the Essenes. Their focus on ritual purity and a communal lifestyle was a radical departure from the religious establishment in Jerusalem, and it shows you just how many different ways there were to practice Judaism at the time. Then you head west toward the shores of Lake Mareotis in Egypt, where you might encounter the Therapeuti. This was another group, described by the Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria, that lived a contemplative, monastic life. The name Therapeuti literally means healers, or worshippers, and they were known for their deep study of sacred texts and their practice of spiritual healing. Unlike the Essenes, they weren't necessarily celibate, but they lived very simple lives, meditating and praying in solitude. They were an early example of an ascetic spiritual community, and their existence shows that the impulse to retreat from the world for a deeper spiritual connection was very much alive and well in the first century. So what does all this have to do with Mary and her death? A lot, actually. These groups, and others like them, show us that the religious landscape was a marketplace of ideas. Early Christians were not just talking to each other, they were interacting with Essenes, Therapeuti, Gnostics, and various pagan mystery cults. The stories they told and the beliefs they held were shaped by this environment. For example, the Essenes' emphasis on purity and the spiritual world over the physical one might have influenced later Christian thinking about Mary's perpetual virginity, and the idea that her body would not be left to decay. A mainstream historical fact you should tuck away is that the concept of a bodily assumption into heaven was not a new or uniquely Christian idea. In fact, many cultures and religions had stories of their heroes or revered figures being taken up to the heavens. Think of the Roman Emperor Augustus, who was said to have ascended to heaven after his death, or the prophet Elijah in the Old Testament, who was carried into heaven in a fiery chariot. So, when the earliest Christian communities began to craft their own narratives about Mary, they weren't inventing something out of whole cloth. They were drawing on a deep shared cultural and religious well of ideas about human divine heroes and their special ends. Now, let's talk about the Gnostics. The word gnosis means knowledge, and these groups believed that salvation came from a secret spiritual knowledge rather than from faith in Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. They often saw the physical world as a flawed, evil creation and salvation, as the escape of the divine spark from the body. This is where it gets a little wild and, for a sleepy listener, a little confusing, so stick with me. Some Gnostic texts, like the Gospel of Mary, Magdalene, not Jesus' mother, portray Mary Magdalene as a more important disciple than Peter. Other Gnostic groups had their own unique takes on Mary, the mother of Jesus, often seeing her as a symbolic figure or a spiritual reality rather than a physical woman. They had a tendency to see the physical body as an impediment to salvation, so the idea of a physical body being assumed into heaven might have been a bit of a head-scratcher for them. The early Orthodox Church had to push back against these ideas, and this is where historians still argue whether the developing veneration of Mary was a direct response to Gnostic spiritualism. By emphasising Mary's physical motherhood and her immaculate purity, the early Church could affirm the goodness of the physical world and the humanity of Jesus. The doctrine of the Incarnation, that God became a real, physical human being, was a core tenet of Orthodox belief, and Mary was its ultimate witness. So in a way, the emerging stories of her death, and later her Assumption, were a theological statement. They were a way for the Church to say, the physical world matters, the human body is good, and this physical woman who carried God had a special and glorious physical end. This is all to say that the story of Mary's death didn't emerge in a vacuum. It was forged in the crucible of intellectual and spiritual debate. The early Church wasn't just telling stories, it was building a theological and social identity in a world full of competing claims. The stories about Mary's dormition or falling asleep were not just narratives. They were theological arguments, a way of affirming the Incarnation, the dignity of the body, and the goodness of creation in a world where many saw the material realm as a prison. So you see, the silence in the Gospels wasn't an empty void. It was a space that was slowly, patiently, filled by a growing tradition, influenced by the very ideas it was often trying to combat. The story of Mary's end, whether you believe it to be historical fact or pious legend, is a testament to the power of a community to create a narrative that reflects its deepest beliefs and longings. It shows us that faith is not just about what is given, but also about what is developed, what is created, and what is lovingly preserved over time. As we continue this journey, we'll see how these early whispers and narratives, born from a mix of piety, theology, and folk legend, began to find their way into the writings of the very people who would shape the future of the Christian world, the early Church Fathers. You might be surprised by what they chose to say, and more importantly, what they chose to leave out. You're now back from the wild fringes of ancient religious thought, trudging along the more established, albeit still very dusty roads of early Christian theology. We've seen the silence of the New Testament and the imaginative leaps of the apocryphal texts. But what about the guys in the middle? What did the great minds of the early church, the so-called Church Fathers, have to say about Mary's final days? You might be picturing a bunch of bearded men in robes sitting around and meticulously recording every detail of Christian history. The reality is a little messier, and frankly, a lot more interesting. Let's start with some of the biggest names. Take Irenaeus of Lyons, for example. He was a prominent bishop in the 2nd century and a student of Polycarp, who in turn was a student of the Apostle John. That's a pretty solid chain of custody, right? You'd think if anyone had a juicy tidbit about Mary's death, it would be him, but you'd be wrong. Irenaeus wrote extensively about Mary, but mostly in the context of her role as the new Eve. His argument was that just as Eve's disobedience led to humanity's fall, Mary's obedience in accepting the role of God's mother reversed that fall. It's a powerful theological point, but when it comes to her end, he's completely silent. His writings, which are foundational to early Christian thought, contain not a single mention of her death, burial, or Assumption. Then you have Tertullian, a fiery 3rd century theologian from Carthage, known for his sharp wit and even sharper condemnations of heresy. He had a lot to say about a lot of things, and his writings give us a fantastic window into early church practice and doctrine. He wrote about Mary's virginity and motherhood, but just like Irenaeus, he offered absolutely no information about her final years or her death. He simply didn't mention it. This silence, coming from someone so prolific and detail-oriented, is profoundly telling. It suggests that at the beginning of the 3rd century, there was simply no established widespread tradition about what happened to Mary. It wasn't an issue of debate or even a topic of interest for the major theologians of the time. A mainstream historical fact to anchor yourself with here is that the primary concern of the Church Fathers was not historical biography, but rather theological defence. They were preoccupied with fighting heresies. They were busy fending off the Gnostics we talked about, who denied Jesus' physical reality, and others who had strange ideas about the Trinity. Their writings were polemical. designed to correct false beliefs and solidify orthodox doctrine. In this context, the details of Mary's death were at best a secondary concern and at worst a distraction. Here's a quirky tidbit you might not expect. One of the earliest hints of a special status for Mary after her death comes from an obscure text called the Apocalypse of the Virgin. This text, which is not considered a part of the biblical canon, describes Mary descending from heaven to intercede for the souls of sinners in hell. She sees their suffering and, in a fit of compassion, convinces God to grant them a day of rest from their torments every year, from Good Friday until Easter. While this doesn't directly mention her death or assumption, it portrays her as a powerful figure in the afterlife, a sort of heavenly advocate for humanity. This text, likely from the 3rd or 4th century, shows the beginnings of a popular piety that elevated Mary to a unique and powerful role, a sentiment that would eventually drive the search for a satisfying narrative about her end. Historians still argue whether the lack of a death narrative in the early Church Fathers' writings is proof that no such tradition existed, or if it was simply a matter of omission, a detail they didn't see as relevant to their theological purpose. It's a chicken and egg problem. Did the absence of a story mean people didn't care, or did they not care because there was no story to latch onto? The very fact that later apocryphal stories filled this void so eagerly suggests that the public was hungry for a narrative, even if the intellectual elite were not providing one. Now it's worth thinking about why they might have been so focused on other things. For the first few centuries, Christianity was a religion of martyrs. The heroic, dramatic death of a saint for their faith was a central part of the Christian story. Figures like Saint Sebastian, riddled with arrows, or Saint Agnes, a young virgin martyred for her faith, were held up as models for believers. A quiet, peaceful death, no matter how holy, simply didn't have the same kind of dramatic power. The idea of a special end for Mary, one that transcended the normal course of death, was perhaps too radical a concept for a young church still finding its way. They were still figuring out the basics of their theology, and the idea of a special non-dying death for a human being might have been seen as a step too far. We also see the beginnings of a shift. By the 4th century, figures like Eusebius of Caesarea, the first church historian, began to collect stories about the apostles and the early saints. He too is silent on Mary's death, but he gives us a sense of a church that is beginning to organise its history and its traditions. It's this very process of organisation and official history-making that eventually creates the space for a definitive narrative about Mary's end. It's the moment when the scattered folk traditions and the apocryphal tales start to be examined and in some cases incorporated into more formal religious thought. So you can see the trend. You have the total silence of the New Testament. Then you have the silence of the intellectual giants of the early church. But at the same time, you have the quiet, popular, and sometimes strange folk traditions that are starting to brew, creating a need for a story. It's a classic bottom-up phenomenon, with popular piety bubbling up and eventually influencing official doctrine. The stage is being set for the moment when a definitive, powerful narrative about Mary's final days will not only be possible, but will be actively sought after. And in our next section, we'll see how those very first, fully formed and highly dramatic stories of the Dormition, or falling asleep, finally make their grand entrance onto the historical stage, filling the silence we've been sitting in for so long. You've been waiting in the silence for what feels like an eternity, but now a new sound begins to emerge. A murmur at first, then a low hum, and finally a full-throated chorus of storytelling. This is the moment the narrative of Mary's death truly begins to take shape, not in the dry theological tracts of the Church Fathers, but in the vibrant, imaginative world of apocryphal literature. These texts, as we touched on before, are the ancient equivalent of viral content, spreading far and wide and capturing the popular imagination in a way that official doctrine simply couldn't. The central story we're focusing on is the Dormition of the Theotokos, or the falling asleep of the God-bearer. The word dormition itself is a beautiful one, coming from the Latin dormitio, which means sleep. It's a softer, more gentle word than death, suggesting a peaceful transition rather than a painful end. This distinction is crucial, as it sets the tone for a narrative that is meant to be glorious and comforting, not grim and sorrowful. The most famous of these texts is the Transitus Mariae, or the Passing of Mary. It's a collection of legends that circulated in various forms from the 4th century onward. Imagine you're listening to a travelling storyteller in a small village in ancient Syria. He's not telling you about the intricacies of the Trinity. He's telling you a story that makes you feel something. His voice dips low as he describes the scene. An angel of the Lord appears to Mary in her home, announcing that her time on earth is almost at an end. The angel brings a palm branch from paradise, a symbol of her imminent arrival in heaven. This is a crucial detail. It frames her death not as a tragedy, but as a homecoming. The story goes that Mary, feeling her time drawing near, sends for the apostles. Now, here's where things get wonderfully and dramatically weird. The apostles, who are scattered all over the known world, from India to Spain, are miraculously transported on clouds to Mary's bedside in Jerusalem. You can just picture it. Peter, John, and the others appearing out of nowhere, dusty and dishevelled, but just in time to say their goodbyes. This is a classic example of a literary device used to bring all the key players together for a grand finale, and it speaks to a deep human desire for a community to be present at the death of a beloved figure. As Mary lies on her bed, the air fills with a heavenly fragrance, and a blinding light appears. Christ himself descends from heaven, surrounded by a chorus of angels. He comes not to take her soul, but to take her body. The Dormition is described as a peaceful, serene event. The apostles sing hymns, and Mary simply closes her eyes and falls asleep. Jesus then takes her soul, which is often depicted as a small childlike figure, into his arms. Now, a quirky or fringe tidbit to chew on. Some versions of this story get even wilder. They include a Jewish man, often named Jophonius, who tries to attack Mary's body out of spite. As he reaches out to touch her bier, his hands are miraculously paralysed and stuck to the coffin. He can only be freed after he repents and professes his faith in Christ. This detail, which seems a bit harsh for a deathbed narrative, serves a clear theological purpose. It's a warning against disrespecting Mary and a demonstration of her powerful sanctity, even in death. It's the kind of story that would have been a blockbuster hit in the ancient world, a mix of divine justice and miraculous healing. A mainstream historical fact is that the rapid spread and immense popularity of these stories were not a coincidence. They filled a narrative void. They gave the common Christian a heroic, beautiful story about the most important woman in their faith. They also provided a powerful counter-narrative to the idea that her end was mundane, or, worse, that her body had simply decayed like anyone else's. The stories began to be recited and performed in local churches, and they spread like wildfire, carried by pilgrims and travelling monks. Historians still argue whether these apocryphal texts were the cause of the popular belief in the Dormition, or simply a reflection of an already existing oral tradition. It's a classic chicken and egg scenario. Did the stories create the belief, or did the belief create the stories? Most scholars today lean toward the latter, seeing these texts as a literary expression of a piety that had been bubbling under the surface for centuries. The Dormition narrative offered a deeply satisfying and emotionally resonant conclusion to Mary's life, one that was fitting for the Mother of God. It affirmed her unique status, not just as a human woman, but as a figure of immense spiritual power. The very existence of these stories, full of miracles and angelic visitations, also tells us something about the audience they were intended for. They were not written for academic theologians. They were written for you, the everyday believer who wanted to feel a connection to these sacred figures. They were the religious equivalent of a gripping page-turner, and their success shows just how much people craved this kind of story. They cemented the idea that Mary's death was not the end but the beginning of her new, glorified life in heaven, a life from which she could still intercede for humanity. This is the point where the silence we've been talking about ends forever. The Dormition narrative, in its various forms, becomes the foundation upon which all future Marian doctrines will be built. It provides a framework for understanding her end not as a finality but as a transition. It sets the stage for a new theological development, one that will eventually lead to the idea that her body didn't just fall asleep, but was actually taken, assumed, into heaven. And as we'll see, the evolution of this story is closely tied to the rise of a new centre of power in the Christian world, the Byzantine Empire, and a new style of imperial devotion that would elevate Mary to a position of unrivaled glory. You're now leaving the sun-baked, dusty world of ancient Judea and moving to the glittering golden domes of Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire. The city of Constantinople, a new Rome is rising to power, and with it, a new style of imperial devotion that will fundamentally reshape the narrative of Mary's end. We've seen her falling asleep in the humble apocryphal texts, but in Byzantium the story gets a royal upgrade. It's no longer just a peaceful sleep, it's a glorious bodily assumption. The word itself, from the Latin assumptio, means taking up. This is a key distinction from dormition, which only implies sleeping. The shift in terminology reflects a dramatic shift in theological and cultural focus. Imagine you're standing in the Hagia Sophia, surrounded by mosaics of gold and jewel-toned tiles. The air is thick with incense, and the chants of the liturgy echo off the massive dome. The Byzantine court was obsessed with hierarchy, splendour, and the veneration of sacred figures. The emperor was God's representative on earth, and his mother was a figure of immense respect. This reverence for the imperial mother naturally translated to the heavenly sphere. If the emperor was glorified, then the mother of the heavenly king must be glorified even more. This is a mainstream historical fact. The rise of the Byzantine Empire and its imperial cult directly influenced the development of Marian veneration. Mary was not just a humble woman from Nazareth. She was the Theotokos, the God-bearer, and the Queen of Heaven. Her end had to be a fittingly majestic event, not a quiet departure. The apocryphal stories of the Dormition, which were already popular, began to be reinterpreted through this new imperial lens. The peaceful falling asleep of Mary was now seen as a prelude to her glorious bodily ascension. Christ, in this new narrative, didn't just take her soul, he took her entire physical body with him into heaven. This idea provided a powerful theological statement. It affirmed that the physical body which Mary had given to God was holy and worthy of glorification. It was a perfect response to Gnostic ideas that still lingered, and it positioned Mary as a new and ultimate Adam, whose body was not destined for decay but for heavenly glory. Now, a quirky or fringe tidbit, there's an early and rather strange story that circulates in this period called the Euthemiac History. It's a text from the early 5th century that describes the finding of Mary's holy girdle in the Holy Land. The story claims that the Empress Pulcheria, a powerful and pious ruler, sent a man to Jerusalem to find the tomb of Mary. The man returned with a box containing the girdle, which was believed to be a miraculous relic that had a divine fragrance and healing powers. But when they opened the tomb, they found it empty. This story, while a bit odd, serves a clear purpose. It provides historical evidence for the empty tomb, which is a necessary prerequisite for the belief in the bodily assumption. It's a great example of how relics and pilgrimage sites, which were central to Byzantine piety, were used to create a physical foundation for a theological belief. Historians still argue whether the empty tomb story in the Holy Land was the original inspiration for the Assumption doctrine, or if it was created after the idea had already gained traction in the East. It's a classic case of tradition and history playing off each other. Did the empty tomb legend give rise to the doctrine, or did the doctrine demand an empty tomb legend? The answer is probably a bit of both. The idea was in the air, and the discovery of the empty tomb provided a physical, tangible reason to believe it. This period also saw the development of some of the most beautiful and moving hymns and liturgical traditions surrounding the Dormition. The Feast of the Dormition became one of the most important feasts in the Eastern Church. Hymnographers like St Andrew of Crete and St John Damascene wrote powerful poems and songs that celebrated Mary's death not as a sorrowful event, but as a joyful reunion with her Son and a glorious passage to heaven. These hymns are a masterclass in emotional and theological storytelling, using vivid imagery of angels, light, and heavenly glory to paint a picture of Mary's transition. The veneration of Mary in Byzantium also had a very practical side. She was seen as a protector of the empire, a sort of divine general who defended Constantinople from its enemies. When the city was under siege, the emperor and the people would process through the streets with an icon of the Virgin, believing that she would protect them. The fact that they saw her as a powerful, active force in the here and now made the belief in her bodily assumption all the more logical. Why would the protector of the empire be left to decay in a tomb? It simply didn't make sense from a theological or cultural perspective. So, in Byzantium, the story of Mary's end evolves from a quiet, pious tale into a grand, imperial narrative. The Dormition is still the core, but the emphasis shifts. It's no longer just about her falling asleep, it's about her being taken up in glory. This is a crucial step in the development of a fully formed doctrine. It takes the popular belief and gives it a theological and cultural weight that it didn't have before. The stage is now set for a showdown, a theological battle that will solidify her position once and for all, and in the next section we'll travel to a pivotal council where her title will be debated and her place in the Christian cosmos will be secured forever. You won't want to miss it. You're stepping out of the grand, gilded halls of Constantinople and onto a rocky, dusty road. The destination, Jerusalem. We've talked a lot about theology and storytelling, but for many people in the ancient world, faith wasn't an abstract idea. It was a physical journey. Pilgrimage was a central part of Christian life, a way to literally walk in the footsteps of Jesus and the saints. And as the veneration of Mary grew, so did the desire to find a physical trace of her on earth. The Holy Land, in this period, becomes a sort of spiritual magnet, pulling believers from all corners of the Roman world. One of the most fascinating figures from this era is a woman named Egeria. She was a pilgrim from Spain or Gaul who travelled the Holy Land in the late 4th century and kept a detailed diary of her journey. Her account is one of the earliest and most valuable records of Christian pilgrimage. She describes the sites she visited, the liturgies she attended, and the tradition she observed. Her diary is a mainstream historical fact, a direct window into what was happening on the ground in Jerusalem. And here's where things get interesting. Egeria mentions visiting a church on the Mount of Olives that was associated with the ascension of Jesus. She describes the deep reverence of the local Christians for the site, but when she's talking about Mary, she doesn't mention a tomb or a specific burial site. The stories she records are of Mary's life, not her death. This is a crucial detail because it suggests that as late as the 4th century, there was no universally recognised or venerated tomb of Mary in Jerusalem. The tradition simply hadn't solidified yet. But by the 5th and 6th centuries, the story changes. You have other pilgrims' accounts, like that of the Piacenza pilgrim, who describes a valley near the Mount of Olives, and a tomb in it that was said to belong to Mary. This is where a quirky or fringe tidbit comes in. This pilgrim's account, written around the year 570 AD, is one of the first to clearly and definitively state that Mary was buried in Jerusalem. He writes that he saw her tomb, and that it was a place of great devotion. The fact that the story appears so much later than the early accounts of Egeria shows how a tradition can emerge and be accepted over a relatively short period of time. Historians still argue whether this Piacenza pilgrim's account is evidence of a long-standing but previously unrecorded tradition, or if it's a newer story that was gaining traction in the 6th century. It's a key debate because it gets to the heart of how these beliefs spread. Was the tradition of Mary's tomb a genuine one, passed down through generations, or was it a pious legend that arose to meet the needs of a growing pilgrimage culture? The place we now know as the Tomb of the Virgin Mary is located in the Kidron Valley, at the base of the Mount of Olives. The church built over the site is a stunning and ancient structure, and it's a powerful place for pilgrims to this day. But the archaeological evidence is a bit of a mixed bag. The earliest structures on the site date back to the 5th century, which aligns with the time we start to see the first mentions of a tomb in the pilgrim accounts. However, there's no hard archaeological or historical evidence to link the site definitively to Mary herself. The site itself is a fascinating palimpsest of history, with layers of Crusader, Byzantine and modern additions. So why would this tradition become so powerful? The answer lies in the human desire for a tangible connection to the sacred. Pilgrimage wasn't just about walking, it was about touching, seeing and experiencing. For a Christian to stand at the place where Mary was said to have been buried, even if the tomb was empty, was a deeply moving and spiritually significant act. It transformed an abstract belief into a concrete reality. The existence of a physical site gave credibility to the apocryphal stories of the Dormition and the Assumption. It was as if the ground itself was speaking, confirming the truth of the celestial narrative. The focus on the empty tomb also served a very specific theological purpose. It drew a clear parallel between Mary and her son. Jesus' resurrection from an empty tomb was the cornerstone of Christian faith. By creating an empty tomb narrative for Mary, the tradition elevated her to a unique status, one that was closer to Christ than to any other human being. It was a visual and visceral way of saying that she was not just a follower of Jesus, but a co-participant in his victory over death. It was the ultimate compliment, a way of signalling her unparalleled holiness and glory. The rise of Mary as a central figure in pilgrimage also meant the creation of new rituals and new forms of devotion. As pilgrims came to Jerusalem, they would often bring back relics, holy water, or small stones from the site. These objects acted as physical reminders of their journey and as a way to bring the holiness of the Holy Land back to their home communities. This, in turn, fueled even more devotion and more pilgrimage, creating a self-sustaining cycle of faith and tradition. So, you see, the story of Mary's End didn't just evolve in the minds of theologians and storytellers. It also evolved on the ground, literally, as pilgrims sought out and eventually created a physical place to commemorate her. The historical silence of the early records was filled not just with stories, but with stone, mortar, and the footsteps of millions of pilgrims, and this tangible physical tradition would provide the perfect backdrop for the next big theological event, one that would cement Mary's place in the Christian cosmos forever. We're going to step out of the dust of Jerusalem and into the halls of power, where a council of bishops will debate her identity and, in doing so, give her a title that will echo through the ages. You've been treading through the dusty roads and ancient legends, but now we're entering a different kind of arena, the intellectual battleground of a church council. It's the year 431 AD, and the city of Ephesus in what is now Turkey is buzzing with thousands of bishops, theologians, and hangers-on. This isn't a sleepy, peaceful gathering. It's a contentious and sometimes violent affair, and the central debate, believe it or not, revolves entirely around Mary. This pivotal moment will not only define her role in Christianity forever, but will also indirectly set the stage for the formal doctrines of her death and assumption. The problem, in a nutshell, was a theological disagreement about the nature of Jesus. A prominent patriarch from Constantinople named Nestorius was arguing against the title Theotokos, which means God-bearer, or Mother of God. Nestorius argued that Mary should instead be called Christotokos, or Christ-bearer. His reasoning was that Jesus was a man with a human nature and a divine nature, and that Mary only gave birth to his human nature. To call her the Mother of God, he argued, was to suggest that she gave birth to God in all his infinite and eternal glory, which was a theological impossibility. You can imagine the commotion this caused. The debate wasn't about Mary per se, but about Christology, the study of the nature of Christ. However, by attacking her title, Nestorius was effectively demoting her in the minds of the people. And the popular piety of the time, especially in places like Ephesus, where there was a strong tradition of honouring goddesses, was having none of it. For them, Mary was a powerful divine figure. This brings us to a mainstream historical fact. The Council of Ephesus was a dramatic and politically charged event. When the council, led by Cyril of Alexandria, condemned Nestorius and affirmed Mary as Theotokos, the people of Ephesus erupted in celebration. They lit torches and processed through the streets, hailing Mary as the Mother of God. This wasn't a dry academic victory, it was a popular triumph. The council's decision wasn't just a theological decree, it was an affirmation of a popular belief that had been building for centuries. The declaration that Mary was the Theotokos had a profound and lasting impact. It elevated her from a simple biblical figure to a central theological one. It meant that she was not just the mother of a man named Jesus, but the one who gave birth to God himself, in human form. This elevated her status to a level that no other human being could ever attain. She was the woman who had contained the infinite. With this, the stage was set for the logic of her assumption to take root. How could the body that had contained the divine be left to decay? It seemed almost sacrilegious to the pious minds of the day. Now for a quirky or fringe tidbit. The city of Ephesus itself had a deep history of goddess worship, particularly of the Greek goddess Artemis. Her temple was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and her cult was massive. When Christianity came to the city, there was a natural and perhaps even subconscious tendency to transfer some of the reverence and titles from Artemis to Mary. Artemis was a virgin goddess, often associated with childbirth and protection. Mary, as the Virgin Mother, was a perfect fit to take on this role in a Christian context. Some historians have even suggested that the immense popularity of the Theotokos title in Ephesus was a direct result of this cultural transference. The people weren't just adopting a new theology, they were repackaging an old one to make it fit. Historians still argue whether the Council of Ephesus was truly a historical event in the development of the Dormition Assumption narratives. Was the proclamation of Theotokos the single catalyst that gave momentum to a pre-existing popular piety? Or was it simply the official recognition of a belief that was already on the verge of exploding? The common consensus is that it was a little bit of both. The council's decision gave the stories a theological seal of approval that they never had before. It made the idea of a glorious end for Mary not just plausible, but theologically necessary. Before this council, Mary's story was a matter of quiet, grassroots piety. After, it became a central and celebrated aspect of official Christian theology. The Dormition was no longer just a beautiful story. It was a fitting end for the woman who was now officially the Mother of God. The Council's decision provided the theological framework that would allow the Dormition and Assumption narratives to evolve and gain legitimacy in the centuries that followed. It's like a piece of a puzzle finally clicking into place, making the whole picture suddenly a lot clearer. The impact of this council cannot be overstated. It was a turning point not just for Mary's veneration, but for the very nature of Christology itself. It solidified the orthodox understanding of Jesus as a single, unified person who was both fully human and fully divine. And in doing so, it ensured that the woman who gave birth to him would be forever venerated as the bridge between humanity and divinity, a figure of unique and unparalleled holiness. From this point on, the debate wouldn't be about if Mary was important, but how important she was. And the stories about her end would continue to grow in grandeur, fueled by the theological validation she had just received. The empty tomb of the pilgrims and the heavenly visions of the apocryphal texts now had the weight of official church doctrine behind them, and they were about to be etched into stone. You're back in Jerusalem, and the air feels different now. It's no longer the silence we started with, but a city humming with faith, a faith that has been officially validated by the Council of Ephesus. The stage is set for a physical, tangible site to commemorate the end of Mary's life, and that's where we return to the tomb of the Virgin Mary in the Kidron Valley. We touched on this before, but now we can dig a little deeper into the archaeological and legendary history of this place, and how its story has shifted and adapted over time to fit the needs of a growing and evolving belief system. Imagine you're a pilgrim from the Byzantine Empire making your way down a flight of stairs into a shadowy, rock-hewn chamber. This is the place. This is where Mary, the Theotokos, was said to have been laid to rest. The earliest structures on this site date back to the 5th century, a perfect alignment with the time when the stories of her Dormition and the need for a physical burial site began to take hold. A mainstream historical fact is that this ancient church was built over what was believed to be an ancient Jewish burial cave, and it was eventually enclosed by a much larger and more elaborate structure built by the Crusaders in the 12th century. The site itself is a physical testament to the evolution of Christian piety, with each successive generation adding a new layer of veneration and architectural splendour. The story of the tomb itself is as complex and layered as the rock it is carved from. For centuries, the empty tomb was seen as a powerful piece of evidence for her assumption. But the question remains, was the tomb empty because she was assumed, or was the legend of the Assumption created to explain why the tomb was empty? As we've discussed, historians still argue this point. The narrative, as it was eventually solidified, went something like this. Mary died, was buried in this very tomb by the apostles, and on the 3rd day, her body was taken to heaven. This narrative neatly combines the Dormition, her death, with the Assumption, the taking up of her body, giving a powerful and complete story. A quirky or fringe tidbit to consider here is a separate tradition that places Mary's tomb not in Jerusalem but in the city of Ephesus, the very place where her title as Theotokos was affirmed. According to this legend, the Apostle John, to whom Jesus entrusted Mary from the cross, took her with him to Ephesus, where she lived out the rest of her days and was buried. There is a small house on a hill outside Ephesus that has been venerated as the House of the Virgin Mary for centuries. This tradition, while not as popular as the one in Jerusalem, is a fascinating counter-narrative. It shows that even in a world with a dominant tradition, regional and alternative legends could persist. For example, some historians have suggested that this Ephesian tradition may have originated as a way to give the city an extra layer of spiritual prestige, making it a new Holy Land. The stories of Mary's tomb also played a crucial role in the political and religious life of the region. The control of these holy sites was a source of great power and influence. The Crusaders, for instance, saw the tomb of Mary as a crucial part of their sacred mission. They built a magnificent basilica over the site, which, while later damaged by earthquakes, cemented the location as a key pilgrimage destination for Western Christians. The different Christian denominations that have coexisted at the site, including Greek Orthodox, Armenian Orthodox and Catholic, have often had to negotiate and share the space, sometimes with conflict, but often with a sort of begrudging respect. This in itself is a micro-history of the Holy Land, a place where sacred spaces are often contested ground. The shift in the stories of the tomb is a reflection of a deeper theological shift. In the early days, as we saw with Egeria, there was no need for a physical tomb because the veneration of Mary was still in its infancy. But as her status grew, as she became the Theotokos and Queen of Heaven, a physical point of reference became essential. The empty tomb was the perfect solution. It allowed believers to have a tangible connection to her on earth, while simultaneously reinforcing the belief that she was no longer there, but in heaven. It was a physical and spiritual paradox, a place of both absence and presence. This is a moment to pause and reflect on the power of relics. The holy girdle of Mary that we talked about earlier, the veil, the supposed pieces of her house, these were all things that made her story real and touchable for people. The tomb, while empty, was the ultimate relic. It was the place where her humanity ended and her divine glory began. It was a place of transition, a liminal space between the human and the divine, and it served as a powerful focal point for prayer, devotion, and contemplation. So, the story of Mary's tomb is not just about a pile of rocks in a valley. It's a story about the intersection of faith and history, of legend and archaeology. It shows us how a belief can create a tradition, and how that tradition, in turn, can solidify a belief. The narratives around the tomb are a living, breathing testament to how Christianity has adapted and evolved over 2 millennia, always finding new ways to tell an ancient story. And while the arguments continue, the pilgrims still come, descending those stone stairs, touching the empty slab, and feeling a connection to the woman who was a mother to God himself. But as we move forward, we'll see that Christianity isn't the only faith that reveres her. In fact, a major world religion has a lot to say about Mary, and its perspective is, in many ways, surprisingly familiar. You're now moving beyond the Christian world, stepping into a different landscape of faith and tradition. We've talked about the Jewish context, the rise of Christian veneration, and the shifting stories in the Holy Land. But what if I told you that one of the most beloved and revered women in Islam is a figure we've been talking about all along? Her name, in Arabic, is Maryam. The Quran, the central religious text of Islam, has a great deal to say about her, and its perspective is, in many ways, both familiar and profoundly different from the Christian narratives. A mainstream historical fact is that Maryam is mentioned more in the Quran than in the entire New Testament. Not only is she mentioned frequently, but she's the only woman named in the Quran. There's even an entire chapter named after her, Surah Maryam, the 19th chapter of the Quran. She's held up as a model of piety, faith and virtue, a figure of immense spiritual authority. The Quranic narrative confirms her virgin birth of Jesus, whom it calls Isa, and considers a great prophet, not the Son of God. This point is crucial. The Quran affirms the miracle of the virgin birth, but it strongly rejects the Christian doctrine of Jesus' divinity and his status as the Son of God. The Quranic account of Maryam's life is a fascinating parallel to the Christian one. It describes her growing up under the care of the prophet Zechariah and her miraculous sustenance where she received food directly from God. It also describes the moment when the angel Gabriel appears to her, announcing that she will give birth to a son, a prophet. When she asks how this can be, as no man has touched her, the angel replies, "Thus it is. Thy Lord says, it is easy for me, and that we may make him a sign for mankind and a mercy from us, and it is a matter decreed." This moment is described with a similar sense of grace and divine intervention as in the Gospel of Luke. Now here's where it gets interesting and a bit of a quirky or fringe tidbit from a Christian perspective. The Quranic account of her birth of Isa is different. She's described as going to a lonely place and giving birth under a date palm tree. In her distress and shame, she cries out, and a voice from below her tells her not to despair, to shake the trunk of the date palm and that fresh dates will fall for her to eat. This scene is not found in any of the Christian Gospels, but it's a powerful and compassionate narrative that emphasizes God's direct and personal care for Maryam in her time of need. The story then goes on to describe how Isa, as an infant, miraculously speaks from the cradle to defend his mother's honour, declaring that he is a servant of God and a prophet. Historians still argue whether the Quranic narratives about Maryam and Isa drew from the canonical Gospels, from apocryphal Christian texts, or from oral traditions circulating in the Arabian Peninsula at the time. The similarities to some of the apocryphal texts are particularly intriguing. For example, some apocryphal Christian texts describe the infant Jesus miraculously speaking from his mother's arms, a detail that echoes the Quranic narrative. This suggests a shared pool of stories that were circulating in the ancient Near East, with each faith tradition selecting and reinterpreting the narratives to fit its own theological framework. When it comes to the question of Maryam's death, the Quran is, like the New Testament, completely silent. There is no mention of her death, her burial, or her assumption into heaven. Islamic tradition generally holds that she died and was buried, a normal human death. There is no concept of a bodily assumption into heaven for her, as that is a unique event reserved for the Prophet Muhammad's night journey, where his body and soul were taken to the heavens, but not to reside there permanently. The lack of an assumption narrative for Maryam in Islam highlights the theological difference between the two faiths. In Islam, Isa the Prophet is the one who was raised to heaven, and his return is a sign of the end times. Maryam is a beloved figure, but she is a human one. The reverence for Maryam in Islam is a beautiful and often misunderstood aspect of the faith. She is seen as one of the four most perfect women, alongside Asiya, the wife of Pharaoh, Khadijah, the first wife of Muhammad, and Fatima, his daughter. The Quran's portrayal of her is a testament to her purity, her piety, and her unwavering faith in God. It provides a shared point of veneration that can, and often does, serve as a bridge between the two great Abrahamic faiths. So, while the two faiths diverge on the ultimate fate of her son, they share a deep and abiding respect for the woman who bore him. The Islamic perspective, by not having a Dormition or Assumption narrative, offers a unique counterpoint to the Christian tradition we've been exploring. It shows us that a figure can be deeply revered and celebrated for her faith and life on earth, without needing a miraculous end. This perspective gives us a chance to reflect on the nature of belief and tradition. What is it that we need in a sacred story? Do we need a miraculous ending, or is a life of faith and virtue enough? This is a question that the East and West, in their differing approaches to Mary's end, will answer in profoundly different ways. You've explored the rich, diverse tapestry of belief surrounding Mary, from the silence of the Gospels to the narratives of Islam. Now, we're back in the Christian world, but we're going to see a fundamental and lasting split. The East and the West, which had been developing their own theological and liturgical traditions for centuries, are about to take two very different paths on the question of Mary's final days. This divergence will lead to a schism that still exists today, a difference in emphasis and practice that tells us a great deal about the two halves of Christianity. Imagine you're a devout Christian in the East, maybe in the Byzantine Empire we talked about. Your feast day for Mary's end is called the Dormition of the Theotokos. This feast is celebrated on August 15th, and it's one of the most important in the Orthodox calendar. The central theme of this day is Mary's falling asleep, her peaceful death, and her glorious transition to heaven. For you, the death is a real event. Mary actually died, like all human beings, and her body was laid in a tomb. The miracle isn't that she didn't die, but that her body was resurrected by her Son and taken to heaven. The emphasis is on her humanity and her victory over death, a victory that she shares with Christ. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Eastern Orthodox Church has always emphasized the Dormition as a real, physical death followed by a bodily assumption. The liturgy of the Dormition is incredibly beautiful and poignant. It is filled with hymns that mourn her death, but quickly shift to hymns that celebrate her glorious resurrection and assumption. The icons of the Dormition show Mary lying peacefully on her deathbed, surrounded by the apostles, with Christ standing over her holding her soul, which is often depicted as a small childlike figure. Now, imagine you're a Christian in the West, in Rome or in medieval Europe. Over time, the Latin-speaking church began to develop a different tradition. While they also celebrated the feast on August 15th, they called it the Assumption of Mary. The word Assumption itself implies something different. It suggests that Mary was taken up directly into heaven, and the question of her death was, for a very long time, left ambiguous. Was it a physical death? Or was it a death of sorts, but without the physical decay that accompanies it? This ambiguity allowed for a different kind of theological development. The emphasis shifted from her victory over death to her special status as being preserved from the corruption of the grave, a special privilege granted to her because of her unique role as the Mother of God. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit from a Western perspective. Some early theologians, like St. Jerome in the 4th century, had doubts about a physical death for Mary, citing the silence of the Gospels. He and others suggested that perhaps Mary's body was never subject to death at all, but was simply assumed into heaven at the end of her life. This idea, while never officially endorsed until much later, shows a theological impulse to make Mary's end even more special, to set her apart from the rest of humanity in a way that the Dormition narrative with its emphasis on her real death did not. Historians still argue whether the Western emphasis on the Assumption, rather than the Dormition, was a direct result of a lack of a strong early apocryphal tradition, like the Transitus Mariae in the East, or was it a result of a different theological emphasis? The Western Church, in its desire for a clear, concise doctrine, often opted for a more dramatic and definitive answer. The idea of an assumption, a sort of preemptive resurrection, fit a certain theological logic in the West. It was seen as a necessary and fitting culmination of her sinless life and her role as the new Eve. The practical results of this divergence are seen in art, theology, and popular piety. In the East, the Dormition icon remains a central image, emphasizing the quiet, serene nature of her death. In the West, the art of the Assumption is often more dynamic and dramatic, showing Mary in a burst of light, rising to heaven, often with angels and cherubs, leaving the earth and its troubles behind. This difference in perspective also highlights a core theological difference between the two traditions. The East has always emphasized a theology of theosis, the idea that human beings can become like God through grace and by participating in the divine life. In this context, Mary's death and resurrection are a model for all believers. Her Dormition is our hope, a sign that we too can overcome death. The West, while also believing in the glorification of the saints, has tended to emphasize a different kind of salvation, often focused on redemption from original sin. In this context, Mary's Assumption is a special privilege, a unique grace granted to her alone. So, you see, the question isn't just about what happened to Mary's body. It's a question about what kind of story we need to tell about our own bodies and our own ultimate fate. Do we see our end as a peaceful sleep and a glorious resurrection, or do we see it as an escape from the corruption of the world? The Eastern and Western traditions, in their different names for the same feast day, offer two different and powerful answers. This divergence will eventually lead to a more formal, dogmatic definition in the West. But before we get there, we need to understand how the veneration of Mary became so powerful in the West, so central to the culture of medieval Europe, that her Assumption became a theological necessity. You've seen how the East and West began to part ways on the issue of Mary's death, but to understand why the Western tradition of the Assumption became so dominant, we need to talk about the Middle Ages. This was the era when the veneration of Mary went from an important theological point to a massive, all-encompassing cultural phenomenon. The cult of Mary isn't a negative term here. It refers to the widespread devotion, art, poetry, and theology that revolved around her. The medieval world was in many ways a world built for Mary. Imagine yourself in a small village in 12th century France. The village church, no matter how humble, is almost certainly dedicated to her. The most beautiful and intricate cathedrals are rising across Europe, their stained glass windows depicting scenes from her life, their towering arches reaching toward her heavenly throne. She is not just a figure from the Bible, she is the Queen of Heaven, the Mother of Mercy, the intercessor for all humanity. This is a mainstream historical fact. The medieval period saw an explosion of Marian devotion, a true golden age of her cult. So, why did she become so incredibly popular? Part of the answer lies in the harsh realities of medieval life. Life was short, brutish, and filled with suffering. The world was seen as a dangerous and sinful place. In this context, Christ, often depicted as a fearsome and just judge, could seem distant and intimidating. People needed an intermediary, a kind and merciful figure who could intercede on their behalf. Mary, as the Mother of God, was the perfect choice. She was seen as someone who understood human suffering, and her maternal compassion was believed to be so great that she could sway her son, even when a sinner didn't deserve it. She was the one to go to with your problems, your fears, your pleas for mercy. This led to a new kind of storytelling and art. The apocryphal legends of her life, which had been circulating for centuries, were now widely read and retold. The image of Mary as a compassionate, sorrowful mother standing at the foot of the cross became a powerful and enduring symbol. But a quirky or fringe tidbit here is the development of the miracles of the Virgin. These were collections of stories that described how Mary miraculously saved people from all kinds of trouble. In one famous story, she saves a monk who had been leading a sinful life by interceding for him after he has a vision of a dragon trying to eat him. She also saves a man who had sold his soul to the devil, and even a woman who had a secret love affair. These stories, while not official doctrine, were incredibly popular and showed her as an active, living, and often very cheeky intercessor in the daily lives of people. They also made her incredibly relatable and accessible, a sort of divine problem solver. Historians still argue whether the veneration of Mary was a grassroots bottom-up movement that was later co-opted by the Church, or if it was a top-down phenomenon initiated by powerful abbots and popes. It was likely a bit of both. The Church recognised the power of her popular appeal and used it to its advantage, building great cathedrals in her name and promoting her as a figure of piety and moral purity. At the same time, the devotion was so deeply rooted in the people's lives that it was impossible for the Church to ignore. The theological justifications for her special status also grew during this period. The idea of her immaculate conception, that she was conceived without the stain of original sin, began to gain traction. While this doctrine wouldn't be formally defined for many centuries, it was a popular belief that fit a certain theological logic. If Christ was to be born from a human woman, it seemed fitting that she should be the purest vessel imaginable. And if she was without sin, it also made her a perfect candidate for the Assumption. Why would someone who never sinned, and whose body was a pure vessel for God, be subjected to the corruption of the grave? It was a theological puzzle that the Assumption neatly solved. The medieval period also saw the development of new devotions like the Rosary, a form of prayer that centred on meditating on the mysteries of the lives of Jesus and Mary. This simple, repetitive form of prayer was incredibly popular and became a cornerstone of Catholic spirituality. It was a way for anyone, regardless of their education, to connect with her and to feel her presence. So, the stage is now set. You have a theological tradition in the West that is leaning toward the Assumption, a popular piety that is making Mary the most important figure in the spiritual lives of millions, and a need for a clear, definitive answer to a question that has been lingering for centuries. The Dormition of the East, with its emphasis on her real death, simply wasn't as satisfying for a Western world that was obsessed with her purity and special status. The idea of an uncorrupted, assumed body seemed like a more fitting end for the Queen of Heaven. The pressure was building for the Church to make a definitive statement, and in the next section, we'll see how a poet and a new form of prayer will further cement her role, making her a figure of both art and devotion. You've seen the sheer power of Marian devotion in the Middle Ages, but to understand its full scope, you need to look at two specific examples that cemented her role in both high art and popular piety. One is a towering literary masterpiece, and the other is a humble prayer tool. Together they show how deeply Mary was woven into the fabric of medieval life, from the educated elite to the simplest peasant. First, let's talk about Dante Alighieri. You're now in 14th century Italy, and you're reading his great work, The Divine Comedy. This epic poem is a journey through hell, purgatory, and finally, paradise. And guess who is the ultimate guide and intercessor in paradise? It's not a male saint or an archangel, it's Mary. A mainstream historical fact is that Dante's vision of paradise is deeply and profoundly Marian. In the final cantos of the Paradiso, Dante is guided through the celestial spheres, and he finally comes face to face with the glorious Queen of Heaven. His guide, Saint Bernard, delivers a powerful prayer to Mary on Dante's behalf, a prayer that is considered one of the most beautiful pieces of literature in the Italian language. The prayer, which begins Vergine Madre, figlia del tuo figlio, Virgin Mother, daughter of your son, is a theological tour de force. It praises Mary as the one who made human nature so noble that its maker did not disdain to be its making. Dante's vision isn't just a poetic flourish, it's a theological statement. He is showing that Mary is the key to salvation. She is the one who, through her obedience, made it possible for God to become human. She is the fountain of hope and the living star that guides humanity to God. Dante's work cemented Mary's role as the compassionate and powerful intercessor, the Queen of Heaven who, with a simple nod, could grant a sinner like Dante entry into the beatific vision. His poetry made the theological concepts of the Assumption and her heavenly power accessible and beautiful, turning them into a narrative that millions could understand and feel. Now, let's turn to a more humble, but equally powerful, tool of devotion, the Rosary. The origins of the Rosary are a bit murky, but by the late Middle Ages it was becoming a widespread and beloved form of prayer. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that the Rosary as we know it today, with its specific prayers and meditations, was not an instant invention. It evolved over centuries, with different forms and prayers circulating. The legend of St. Dominic receiving the Rosary directly from Mary in the 13th century, while a beautiful story, is likely a pious legend meant to give it a noble and ancient origin. In reality, it was a grassroots movement. It was a way for lay people, many of whom were illiterate, to participate in a deep, contemplative form of prayer. The Rosary is, in essence, a mini-meditation on the lives of Jesus and Mary. By praying the Hail Mary over and over, while contemplating the mysteries of their lives, from the Annunciation to the Crucifixion to the Assumption, a person could feel a connection to their sacred story. It was a tactile form of prayer, with the beads providing a physical way to keep track of the prayers. It was democratic in its nature. You didn't need a priest or a book to pray it. You just needed a string of beads and a heart full of devotion. The Rosary cemented the popular piety of Mary, making her a daily presence in the lives of millions. It was a personal, intimate devotion that could be practiced anywhere, and it reinforced the idea of her as a compassionate, motherly figure who was always present and ready to listen. Historians still argue whether the invention and popularisation of the Rosary was a direct response to the Reformation, or if it was an earlier phenomenon that simply gained new importance during the religious turmoil of the 16th century. It's a compelling debate because it gets to the heart of how different forms of piety emerged and spread. Was it an act of protest against a changing religious landscape, or was it simply the culmination of centuries of devotion? The answer is likely a little of both. The Rosary was a powerful tool for reinforcing traditional Catholic beliefs at a time when they were under attack. It was a way to double down on the devotion to Mary and the saints, when the Reformers were trying to do away with them. So you see, the story of the Assumption didn't just grow in the minds of theologians, it grew in the hearts of poets and the hands of peasants. Dante gave it a literary grandeur that made it a central part of Western culture, and the Rosary gave it a popular accessibility that made it a central part of daily life. The two together created a powerful cultural force that made the idea of a humble woman being assumed into heaven not just a theological possibility, but a beautiful and deeply moving reality. This widespread, deeply felt devotion would provide the bedrock for the next great challenge to Marian piety, the Protestant Reformation. And as we'll see, the challenges from the Reformers would only serve to strengthen and clarify the Catholic response, pushing the Church to a final, formal definition of her death and Assumption. You've now arrived at a moment of profound change, a seismic shift that will fracture the Christian world. It's the 16th century, and the Protestant Reformation is sweeping across Europe, challenging the very foundations of the Roman Catholic Church. This era of theological upheaval was not kind to the veneration of saints, and Mary, as the preeminent saint, became a central point of contention. The arguments of the Reformers would force the Catholic Church to reconsider its beliefs about her, and in doing so they would inadvertently set the stage for a more formal, dogmatic definition of the Assumption. Imagine you're a German friar named Martin Luther. You believe that salvation comes through faith alone, not through good works or the intercession of saints. The medieval devotion to Mary and the saints seems to you to be a distraction from the central figure of Christ. Luther and other reformers like John Calvin and Huldrych Zwingli argued that the veneration of Mary had become a form of idolatry, with people praying to her more than they prayed to God. They were deeply uncomfortable with the idea of Mary as a mediatrix or a co-redeemer, roles that they believed belonged to Christ alone. A mainstream historical fact is that the Reformers, while rejecting the cult of Mary, did not completely reject her. Luther, for example, had a deep and abiding respect for Mary as the Theotokos, the Mother of God, and he affirmed her perpetual virginity. However, he rejected the more elaborate doctrines and traditions that had built up around her, including her Assumption. For the Reformers, if a doctrine or tradition was not explicitly found in the Bible, it was suspect. And as we know, the Bible is completely silent on the matter of Mary's death and Assumption. The Reformers saw this as a fatal flaw, a tradition of men rather than a revelation from God. This is where the Catholic Church had to mount a serious and sustained defence. The Council of Trent, which convened in the mid-16th century, was the Catholic Church's response to the Reformation. The Council reaffirmed the traditional teachings of the Church, including the veneration of saints and the use of relics and images. It was a firm restatement of Catholic doctrine in the face of a Protestant attack. The Council of Trent didn't officially define the Assumption as a dogma, but it implicitly defended the veneration of Mary and the traditions that had grown up around her for centuries. Now, a quirky or fringe tidbit. During the Reformation, some Protestant polemicists would mock the stories of Mary's Dormition and Assumption, calling them fables and old wives' tales. They saw the stories as a sort of religious fan fiction that had no basis in Scripture. But this very criticism forced Catholic theologians to look for better, more systematic theological justifications for their beliefs. They began to argue for the Assumption not just on the basis of apocryphal texts, but on the basis of a deeper theological logic. They reasoned that if Mary was preserved from the stain of original sin from the moment of her conception, a doctrine that was gaining more and more support, then it was only fitting that she would also be preserved from the corruption of the grave, which was seen as a consequence of that sin. The logic was simple: no sin, no death, no death, no decay. Historians still argue whether the Protestant Reformation was the single most important factor in forcing the Catholic Church to formally define the Assumption. It seems clear that the challenges from the Reformers created an urgency that hadn't existed before. For centuries, the Dormition Assumption was a beloved tradition, a matter of popular piety and theological consensus. But when it came under attack, the Church felt the need to solidify its position, to make a clear, definitive statement that would settle the matter once and for all. It's a classic case of external pressure leading to internal consolidation. The Catholic response wasn't just theological, it was also cultural. The Baroque art that followed the Reformation was a powerful visual counter-argument. Artists like Caravaggio and Rubens created dramatic and emotionally charged paintings of the Dormition and Assumption, full of light, movement, and heavenly glory. These paintings were meant to inspire awe and devotion, to remind the faithful of the sacred reality that the Protestants were denying. The art was a tool of evangelization and a defense of the faith. The Reformation also led to a renewed emphasis on the Rosary and other Marian devotions. The Rosary became a symbol of Catholic identity, a way to show your allegiance to the traditional faith. It was a tangible protest against the new ideas of the Reformers. This renewed piety, combined with the theological arguments, created an unstoppable momentum toward a formal definition. The stage was set for a pope hundreds of years later to take the final step and declare the Assumption a matter of faith for all Catholics. The debates of the 16th century, while seemingly a step back for Marian devotion, were in fact a crucial step forward, a purification and a clarification that would ultimately lead to a final and definitive statement. You've witnessed the rise of Marian piety, the schism between East and West, and the attacks of the Reformation. Now, centuries of popular belief, theological reasoning, and historical debate will finally culminate in a single definitive act. It's the 20th century, and the Roman Catholic Church is about to formally define a dogma that has been debated and believed for nearly 2 millennia. This is the moment when a tradition of the people becomes a required article of faith. The final piece of this puzzle falls into place on November 1st, 1950. Imagine you're standing in a St. Peter's Square in Rome, a sea of 500,000 people gathered from all over the world. The atmosphere is electric with anticipation. From the balcony, Pope Pius XII raises his voice and solemnly proclaims, "We pronounce, declare and define it to be a divinely revealed dogma, that the Immaculate Mother of God, the ever-Virgin Mary, having completed the course of her earthly life, was assumed body and soul into heavenly glory. This is the moment." A mainstream historical fact is that this proclamation, issued in the papal bull Munificentissimus Deus, formally and infallibly defined the Assumption of Mary as a dogma of the Catholic faith. It's crucial to understand what this means. A dogma is a truth revealed by God that requires the assent of faith from all Catholics. It's not just a beautiful story or a pious belief, it's a binding doctrine. For For the first time, Catholics were required to believe that Mary was taken, body and soul, into heaven at the end of her life. The proclamation didn't answer every question, though. It was a careful and deliberate statement. Notice the phrase, having completed the course of her earthly life. The Pope deliberately left the question of whether or not she actually died an open one. It was a way to honour the Eastern tradition of the Dormition, which insists on a physical death, while still affirming the Western tradition of the bodily Assumption. It was a brilliant and subtle piece of theological manoeuvring. The reasoning behind this formal definition was multifaceted. As we've discussed, the belief had been gaining traction for centuries, but the 20th century provided new reasons for the Church to act. A quirky or fringe tidbit is that before making the proclamation, Pope Pius XII conducted a survey of all the bishops in the world, asking for their opinion on whether the time was right to define the dogma. The response was overwhelmingly positive, showing a near unanimous consensus among the Catholic hierarchy. This was not a top-down decision made in a vacuum. It was a response to a global, deeply felt piety. The timing was also significant. The mid-20th century was a time of immense turmoil and uncertainty, a world reeling from 2 world wars and grappling with the rise of atheistic ideologies. The definition of the Assumption was a powerful statement of hope and a reminder of the ultimate destiny of humanity, not decay and destruction, but heavenly glory. Historians still argue whether this definition was an organic development of the faith or a calculated political and theological move. Some scholars see it as a beautiful culmination of a long-standing tradition, a final piece of a puzzle that had been forming for centuries. Others see it as a modern invention, a way for the Church to double down on its traditions in an age that was becoming increasingly secular and sceptical. The debate is a fascinating one, and it gets to the heart of how doctrine develops over time. The Catholic Church's position is that the dogma was not new, but was always part of the deposit of faith, simply now being formally articulated. It was a kind of unveiling of a truth that had been present since the beginning. The definition of the Assumption also had a profound impact on modern Marian devotion. The feast day of August 15th, already a major celebration, gained new importance and solemnity. It became a powerful reminder of the ultimate goal of Christian life, a bodily resurrection and a place in heaven. It also solidified Mary's role as the Queen of Heaven, the perfect example of a human being who had achieved their full potential and now reigns in glory with her Son. This dogma, while rooted in ancient traditions, is a surprisingly modern one. It was a proclamation made in a time of mass communication, a time when the world was shrinking and the Pope's voice could be heard by millions. It was a statement meant not just for Catholics but for the world, a reminder that the spiritual reality of a glorified human body was a central part of the Christian worldview. It also serves as a final, definitive point of theological separation from the Protestant world, which, with its emphasis on sola scriptura, Scripture alone, could not accept a dogma that was not explicitly in the Bible. So, the long journey of Mary's end, from the silent streets of Jerusalem, to the golden halls of Byzantium, to the artistic heights of the Renaissance and the political turmoil of the Reformation, finds its ultimate conclusion in this modern definitive statement. It is a testament to the power of tradition, the force of popular piety, and the slow but steady development of theology over time. The question of her death is now officially settled, at least for 1 billion Catholics. But for historians and scholars, the question remains. How do we, in a modern, sceptical world, approach this ancient story? What does it mean to a mind trained in a world of scientific inquiry? That, my sleepy friend, is our next journey, and it's a journey we'll have to take with a different kind of lens. You've seen how faith, tradition, and dogma have shaped the story of Mary's end, culminating in the 1950 proclamation. But now, you're going to put on a different kind of lens, one that is detached from creed and focused on evidence. We're going to step into the world of modern scholarship, history, theology, and archaeology, to ask the question, what do we actually know about the end of Mary's life, stripping away the centuries of legend and piety? The answer, from a purely historical and scientific perspective, is a bit of a letdown after all this drama. The facts are incredibly scarce. As we've seen, the earliest historical records, including the New Testament and the writings of the most prominent church fathers, are completely silent. This silence is a mainstream historical fact that no serious scholar disputes. Modern historians and biblical scholars, operating on the principle of methodological naturalism, the idea that historical events can only be understood through natural observable causes, have to conclude that there is no historical evidence for the bodily assumption of Mary. So how do they approach this topic? They don't necessarily say that the assumption didn't happen. Instead, they say that it is a dogma of faith and not a historical fact. This is a crucial distinction. A historical fact is something that can be verified through contemporaneous sources, archaeological evidence, or other forms of objective proof. The assumption, by its very nature, is a miraculous event that lies outside the realm of natural inquiry. Historians, therefore, treat the stories of the Dormition and Assumption as a form of piety-driven narrative, not as a record of a historical event. They analyse the stories to understand what they meant to the people who wrote and believed them, rather than to verify their factual accuracy. Now, a quirky or fringe tidbit to consider. Some modern biblical scholars, in a truly interesting twist, are re-examining the silence of the Gospels. They argue that the reason for the silence isn't because Mary wasn't important, but because she was too important. The early Christian communities, they suggest, saw her as such a vital link to the historical Jesus that they were hesitant to write about her death, much in the way a family might be silent about the death of a beloved matriarch. This is, of course, a speculative theory, but it shows the creative ways that scholars are still trying to grapple with the historical void. Historians still argue whether the long delay in the development of the Dormition and Assumption narratives is a sign of their non-historicity, or simply a reflection of the slow, organic growth of tradition. It's a classic debate. The traditional Catholic position would be that the belief was always there, in the hearts of the faithful, but simply took time to develop into a formal doctrine. The skeptical historical position would be that the belief was an invention, a legend that grew over time to satisfy a spiritual need. Modern scholarship, in its best form, avoids making a judgment one way or the other, and instead focuses on tracing the evolution of the belief itself, from apocryphal text to formal dogma. Archaeology also has a say here. We've already talked about the archaeological history of the so-called Tomb of the Virgin Mary in Jerusalem. Modern archaeologists have excavated the site and have concluded that while it is an ancient burial cave, there is absolutely no evidence, no bones, no inscriptions, no artifacts, to definitively link it to Mary. They also note that the architectural history of the site doesn't begin until the 5th century, centuries after Mary's life, which suggests that the veneration of the site began much later. The archaeologist's conclusion is a firm one. The site is a place of powerful and ancient veneration, but it is not a verified historical tomb. It is a space where faith and history intersect, a physical monument to a powerful belief, but not a piece of historical evidence for the belief itself. In the end, modern scholars approach the question of Mary's death and assumption with a sense of humility and intellectual rigour. They recognise that faith and history are two different ways of knowing. Faith operates on the basis of revelation and belief, while history operates on the basis of evidence and reason. They are not necessarily in opposition, but they are different. A scholar can say, from a historical perspective, there is no evidence for the assumption, while a believer can say, I believe in the assumption, because it is a divinely revealed truth. Both statements can be true within their own spheres. So, where does this leave us? It leaves us with a deeper understanding of the story we've been tracing. The story of Mary's end is not a simple linear narrative. It is a complex and layered tapestry, woven from biblical silence, popular piety, theological debate, and cultural need. It is a story that tells us more about the people who told it than it does about Mary herself. It is a story that shows us how a faith can grow and adapt, how a tradition can be born from a void, and how a belief can be solidified into an unassailable dogma. And in our final sections, we'll reflect on what this story tells us about the human need for such narratives and the enduring power of faith, even in a world that is obsessed with facts and evidence. You've sifted through the historical facts and the archaeological evidence, and you're left with a conclusion that a purely rational mind finds unsatisfying. There's no proof. But to stop there would be to miss the deeper, more profound truth of the matter. The story of Mary's Assumption is not just a theological proposition, it is a psychological and emotional one. It speaks to a deep, primal human need for a certain kind of story, a narrative that gives meaning to our own lives and our own inevitable end. Imagine for a moment that you live in a world without modern medicine or scientific explanations for death. Death is a mysterious and terrifying process. The body, once a living, breathing vessel, becomes a source of decay and corruption. The smell, the sight, the finality. It's a brutal reality. The idea of a loved one's body being left to the grave is a sorrowful one. So, what if there was a different story? What if the body of someone so pure, so holy, was spared this fate? The belief in the Assumption offers a powerful and comforting counter-narrative to the grim reality of the grave. It suggests that death doesn't have to be the end, and that the body can be glorified, not corrupted. This is a mainstream historical fact. The human fear of death and bodily decay is a powerful motivator for the creation of religious narratives that offer hope and transcendence. Now, let's talk about the psychological role of Mary herself. She is the ultimate feminine figure, the mother, the protector, the source of compassion. In a world where the divine was often portrayed as a powerful and at times intimidating male figure, Mary offered a soft, gentle face. She was the one you could turn to when you were afraid, the one who would intercede for you with her son. The idea of her being taken body and soul into heaven is the ultimate fulfillment of her role. It shows that she is not just a historical figure, but an active, living and powerful presence in the heavenly court. The Assumption is, in a way, the ultimate tribute to the power of the feminine divine. It says that the feminine principle is not just a part of the human story, but a central part of the divine one. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit. Some psychologists and scholars of religion have suggested that the belief in the Assumption is a manifestation of a kind of collective wish fulfillment. It's a way for us as a species to project our own deepest longings for an escape from death onto a perfect and holy figure. We want to believe that we too can be saved from the finality of the grave, and the story of Mary's Assumption offers a beautiful and powerful symbol of that hope. It's a way of saying, if it could happen to her, a human just like me, then it can happen to me too. Historians still argue whether the development of the Assumption narrative was a conscious theological project or an unconscious psychological one. Was it a deliberate move by the Church to elevate Mary's status, or was it a spontaneous and organic expression of the human heart's longing for salvation and transcendence? The answer is likely both. The Church, in its wisdom, recognised a powerful and deeply held popular belief and gave it a theological and dogmatic form. But the belief itself, the root of the story, came from a very human place. It came from a desire to see our own human nature, our own bodies, and our own final ends in a new and glorious light. The belief in the Assumption also serves a very important social and cultural function. It provides a powerful female role model who is not defined by traditional power structures. She's not a queen, a warrior, or a ruler, but a mother. Her power comes not from force, but from compassion. In a world that has often struggled with gender roles and the place of women in society, the story of the Assumption offers a truly revolutionary vision of a woman who is not only a part of the divine plan, but a central and crucial part of it. Her glorification is a glorification of human nature itself and of the feminine principle within it. So when we look at the story of Mary's Assumption, we're not just looking at a theological debate. We are looking at a story that tells us something profound about ourselves. It tells us about our hopes, our fears, our desires for meaning, and our longing for an end that is not an end but a beginning. It is a story that, while not historically verifiable, is deeply and profoundly true on an emotional and psychological level. It is a story that has endured for 2,000 years, not because it is a historical fact, but because it is a human truth. And as we move into our final sections, we will reflect on what this all means for us today, as we grapple with the same questions of faith, doubt, and the nature of reality. You've come to the end of our historical and psychological journey, and you're standing at the crossroads of two different ways of knowing. On one side, you have the road of faith, which is built on tradition, revelation, and the deep emotional truths we've been exploring. On the other, you have the road of historical reality, which is built on evidence, verifiable facts, and the rigorous process of scholarly inquiry. The question of whether the Virgin Mary really died or was taken to heaven forces us to confront this crossroads head-on. It's a powerful and personal moment, because it asks you, the listener, to decide which road you'll take and how you will reconcile the two. For many people, the two roads are not in conflict. A person of faith can believe in the Assumption of Mary as a divinely revealed truth, even while acknowledging that there is no historical or archaeological evidence to support it. They can see the silence of the Gospels not as a lack of evidence, but as a testament to the mystery and sacredness of the event. To them, the truth of the Assumption is a different kind of truth, a spiritual truth that transcends the limitations of human history and scientific proof. This is a crucial point. Faith and history can coexist, but they operate on different principles. The stories we've explored are not just a record of the past, they are a living, breathing part of a spiritual tradition. Now, a quirky or fringe tidbit. There's a small but fascinating group of Catholic theologians and scholars who have in recent decades begun to explore the possibility of a historical kernel within the Dormition Assumption narratives. They look for possible, though unprovable, human-scale events that might have given rise to the legend. For example, what if Mary did live a long, quiet life and died peacefully, and her burial place was simply lost to history? What if the apocryphal stories were a beautiful and imaginative way of processing the loss of a truly sacred person? This approach seeks to find a bridge between the two roads, to see if there is a way to hold on to the story's spiritual power, while also acknowledging the human reality of its origins. It's a way of saying that the story, even if not historically factual, is a beautiful and meaningful truth that tells us something profound about our faith. Historians still argue whether the concept of a historical kernel is a legitimate scholarly pursuit or a kind of special pleading, a way of trying to have it both ways. It's a key debate because it gets to the heart of what history is for. Is history meant to affirm our beliefs, or is it meant to challenge them? The best historical scholarship, in my opinion, does both. It challenges us to confront the uncomfortable silences and the historical nature of our traditions, but it also gives us a richer, more nuanced understanding of how those traditions came to be. It shows us that faith is not a static thing, but a living, growing process that is shaped by time, culture, and human need. The story of Mary's End is, in a way, a perfect case study for this kind of reflection. It shows us that traditions are not always passed down perfectly. They are transformed, added to, and reinterpreted over time. The apocryphal stories, the Byzantine veneration, the medieval cult, the Reformation debates, and the modern dogma. Each step was a response to a particular historical moment and a particular human need. The story of Mary's Assumption is, therefore, a testament to the creative power of the human heart, its capacity to take a void and fill it with a beautiful and hopeful narrative. So, where do you stand? Do you hold on to the story of the Assumption as a divinely revealed truth? Do you see it as a beautiful but ultimately a historical legend? Or do you stand in the middle trying to find a way to reconcile the two? There is no right or wrong answer here. The journey we've taken together is not meant to give you a definitive conclusion, but to give you the tools to think for yourself. It's meant to show you the richness and complexity of a story that, on the surface, seems so simple. The end of Mary's life, whether in a tomb or in a heavenly glory, is a reminder that some of the most profound truths are not found in the cold, hard facts, but in the stories we tell about ourselves and our place in the universe. The story of her end is a story of hope, a story of the triumph of life over death, and a story of a woman who, through her perfect obedience, became a model for all humanity. And as we move into our final section, we will bring all of this together and offer a final, quiet reflection on the power of this enduring myth, or, if you prefer, this enduring truth. You've sat with the silence, you've heard the whispers, you've walked the roads, and you've felt the power of a story that grew from a seed of absence into a towering tree of belief. Now, as the hour grows late and the world outside has faded to quiet, we arrive at our final reflection. The question we began with, did the Virgin Mary really die, or was she taken to heaven, is not one that can be answered with a simple yes or no. It is instead a question that reveals a profound truth about the nature of faith, history, and the human heart. The story of the Assumption is, above all, a story of hope. It is a narrative that speaks to our deepest longings, the desire to overcome death, to be reunited with our loved ones, and to have a final end that is not one of decay but of glory. From the beginning, the story of Mary's End was an act of hope. It was a way for early Christians living in a brutal world to say that a life of holiness and obedience could lead to a different kind of ending. The image of a humble woman who said yes to God, being taken, body and soul, into heaven, is a powerful visual metaphor for the ultimate destiny of all humanity. It tells us that our bodies, which are so often sources of pain and suffering, are not just temporary vessels, but are destined for a final, glorious state, The story's development also tells us something about the nature of tradition. A mainstream historical fact is that traditions are not static. They are living things that grow and change over time. The belief in Mary's dormition and assumption was not an overnight invention. It was a slow and organic process, a collective act of storytelling that began in the hearts of the people and was eventually formalized by the Church. The stories of the miraculous transportation of the apostles, the empty tomb in Jerusalem, and the heavenly choirs, these were not attempts to deceive, but a way for a community of believers to give voice to a truth they felt in their hearts. They were a way of saying that Mary's end had to be special because her life was special. They were an act of faith, a way of filling in the gaps where history fell silent. Here's a quirky or fringe tidbit to leave you with. Some modern theologians and scholars have even suggested that the story of the Assumption is a kind of reverse incarnation. The Incarnation, as you know, is the story of how God became human, how the divine took on flesh. The Assumption is the story of how a human, through her holiness, was raised to the divine. It is the perfect theological bookend to the story of Jesus' life. It shows that the bridge between heaven and earth is a two-way street, that God's love and grace are not just a one-time event, but an ongoing process that culminates in the glorification of humanity. It is a beautiful and compelling idea, one that gives the story a cosmic significance that transcends the question of its historical reality. Historians still argue whether the formal definition of the dogma in 1950 was the culmination of a natural process or a final, decisive move to close the door on debate. But the reality is that for 1 billion Catholics the debate is over. The Assumption is a matter of faith. For 1 billion Orthodox Christians, the Dormition is the tradition they hold dear. And for billions of others, the story of Mary is a beautiful and compelling myth, a tale that reveals something profound about the human spirit. The enduring power of the story lies not in its historical veracity, but in its ability to speak to a deep and abiding spiritual need. So, as you lay your head down, you can choose which narrative to hold in your heart. You can choose to believe that Mary, having completed her earthly life, was taken, body and soul, to be with her Son in glory. You can believe that her peaceful dormition was a sign of her victory over death. Or you can simply hold the story as a powerful and beautiful work of art, a testament to a human need for a divine narrative. The beauty of it is that all of these are true in their own way. The journey you've taken from the silence to the dogma, from the human to the divine, is a microcosm of the journey of faith itself. It is a journey that is not about finding a single, verifiable fact, but about finding a truth that resonates with the deepest parts of your soul. The candles have burned low, the fire is now just a few embers, and the world has fallen completely silent. The mystery of her end remains, a beautiful question mark at the end of a long and complex story. But perhaps that is where it is meant to be. Perhaps the most important truths are the ones we cannot prove, the ones that live in the quiet places of our hearts, waiting for us to find them. Now, let the journey fade to a whisper, the figures and places soften into memory. The dusty roads, the gilded halls, the humble tomb, all of it is now a part of the vast and beautiful history we've explored together. Close your eyes, let the soft hum of the fan be your guide, and let the long sweet story of her life and her beautiful mysterious end be a lullaby for the night.